Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Irlbacher Fox to the stage. Masicholi.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here today, and also to express my thanks for being able to be here on the Chief Dragi's traditional territory of the Yellowknives Dene. I'm not here today to talk about traditional knowledge or its content, or to give opinions about how it has been used or should be used. What really holds my attention about traditional knowledge is that it is so contested. That is, it's the subject of a lot of debate about what it is, what it's not, how it can be used, how it could be used, how it cannot or should not be used. I don't read these debates as really being about traditional knowledge itself. Instead, I think that these debates are really about traditional knowledge posing a major challenge to existing colonial dominant-subordinate relations at the institutional level. In other words, this is a political fight dressed up as an intellectual one. I also see these debates happening because fundamentally, the use of traditional knowledge in existing institutions and processes confronts and delegitimizes colonial settler privilege. At the same time, the use and the fostering of traditional knowledge not only highlights Indigenous peoples' culturally based relationship with and belonging to the land, it's also generative of land relationship. And I think this in itself becomes a basis for Indigenous peoples' political refusal of settler colonialism. And that's embodied by their rebuilding and resurgence of Indigenous cultural, land-based relationship and ways of life. My first exposure to traditional knowledge happened in the 1990s. It was when the government of the Northwest Territories had just established their traditional knowledge policy. So my master's degree studies looked at, is that traditional knowledge policy being used within programs and services in the government of the Northwest Territories? This was shortly after the Dene land claims, the Gwich'in and the Sahtu land claims had been settled. And those land claims, after the Inuvialuit land claim, were the first to actually legally require that traditional knowledge be taken into consideration when making resource management decisions through the co-management system. And I think that is what really sparked these debates in earnest. Suddenly people had to take traditional knowledge, as it's called, seriously. After that, I went on to work in the area of self-government negotiations mainly, and other political development processes with Indigenous communities throughout the Northwest Territories. And in that work, I did, and I continue to, over the last 18 years, have to sit down and really think about how traditional knowledge and Indigenous culture can be used at the institutional level. How will it be used as a basis for governing institutions, for governance decision-making? And through that process, I have been lucky to spend a lot of time with Indigenous elders, Inuvialuit, Gwich'in, Sahtu, elders from the Decho, Métis elders as well, and really talk to them about Indigenous culture and Indigenous knowledge generally. And we've had to sit together and try to figure out, how do we take that land-based knowledge and bring it into Indigenous peoples' governments? The flip side of this was having to go to the negotiating table with the negotiators that I worked with and try to talk with government about how this could be done. And so it was those discussions with government that really got me thinking a lot about colonialism. Now, colonialism, as probably most of you know, is a situation where a foreign government comes to a place that they're not from, and they take control of the people, the lands, and the resources, usually for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the original people who were there. This is for a lot of people where the analysis stops. And I think in recent years, some scholars have really been going beyond this analysis, because it's not enough to just say that the government has colonial policies, and that is a root of the problem. Because the government isn't society. We are society. People are society, all of us, settlers and Indigenous people alike. So colonialism results in what's known as settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is a situation which both results in and sustains a set of social relations between settlers and non-Indigenous people. And within these relations, settlers exercise different kinds of privilege. That means that they have advantage at the expense of Indigenous peoples. And this, for example, would be benefiting from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples' lands and the marginalization of Indigenous peoples politically. So what does this have to do with the debates going on around traditional knowledge? One example I can give you, I guess, is just looking at the debates that scholars and policymakers have spent a lot of time talking about and really working on. So they're having debates about definitions of traditional knowledge, a lot of comparisons between Indigenous knowledge and Western science. How do you reconcile the two? How do you make them work together? And thinking about ways to decide or measure what parts of traditional knowledge are useful and what parts aren't so useful. So within these debates, it's settler colonial or non-Indigenous scientists and policymakers who position themselves as the legitimate or the natural arbiters or decision makers of what traditional knowledge is and to what extent it's valid. This is an example of settlers asserting their privilege. I find it really interesting to think about what a lot of times scientists and policymakers don't do. They don't turn the lens on themselves. They don't ask how their own settler colonial privilege creates and sustains unreasonable questioning or rejection of Indigenous knowledge. They don't think about how settler privilege creates and sustains institutions and decision-making processes that are unjustifiably incapable of using traditional knowledge as a basis for decision-making or informing how the institutions themselves should actually operate. And there's, in addition to that, really not a lot of thinking or discussion about why, before the Dene land claims were put in place, there wasn't really a whole lot of discussion about traditional knowledge at all. And I think this approach tells us a lot about our society in general, because this approach of settler colonial power holders not doing self-introspection to figure out whether they are actually part of the problem is consistent with broader narratives in our society. And that is that Indigenous peoples are always defined as a problem. But the reality is there is no Indian problem, as a lot of people call it. What we actually have on our hands is a settler problem. And as long as settler governments have colonial policies that continue to create structures of privilege for settler colonials that are rooted in ongoing injustice, we will continue to have problems, to have clashes between Indigenous peoples and settler populations. And we won't be making much progress with respect to achieving justice for Indigenous peoples. Another element of this that I think it's really important to consider, particularly when we're talking about traditional knowledge, is something that I've learned over the last 18 years of working with various government policies, looking at them as an academic, and trying to work within them at negotiating tables and with communities that I work with, is that in all of the Canadian government's and other governments' policies towards Aboriginal people, the prime directive of those policies is to break the relationship between Indigenous peoples and their lands. This has been true right on through from the first iteration of the Canadian Indian Act on through residential schools, which physically removed people took them away from their culture, their communities, their lands, their families, right up to contemporary economic development policies and land claim and self-government policies. It's really important, I think, for settler society, in their view, that that happens. Because once you break people's spiritual, cultural, and sense of belonging to their lands, once that relationship is gone, it opens up those lands to be viewed quite differently. The relationship to the land is the one that generates and fosters Indigenous knowledge and strong, confident people and strong relationships between people. Once you no longer have that, land can be commodified. It can be seen as a thing that you can do things with, most likely to try to make money. And what that also does is it narrows the opportunities for Indigenous people to form those very important spiritual, cultural, and social land-based relationships. I think it's a real testament to the strength and the resilience of Indigenous people that they've often been able to take these government policies and use them in sort of subversive ways. So they use them in the exact opposite way that they were intended. In particular, there's some really good examples of what Indigenous governments are doing, and the kinds of things they're doing are they're actually building places on the land, places where people can come and meet. I'm thinking of the Gwich'in wellness camp on the Mackenzie River. The Inuvialuit have a place called Reindeer Station. The Clecho government has the Trails of Our Ancestors canoe trips that they go on every summer. So what these Indigenous governments are doing is they're undertaking, reconnecting people with their land and creating that space of resurgence. And it has the effect of strengthening relationships between people and strengthening Indigenous nations. And I think that's part of that is because Indigenous people have what I think is something that we can call the intransigence of the truth. They have a truth that's never going to go away. It may be inconvenient to settler colonialism, but that will not make it go away. What they have is these very important and very deep, culturally rooted, vital relationships with their lands. And those things have endured, no matter what governments or settlers have thrown at Indigenous peoples. So for me, what this means is that as settlers, we have work to do. I am non-Indigenous. I am a settler here on Dene lands, and many of you in the room are as well. We need to take personal responsibility and be vigilant and understand and connect how our personal actions are part of this larger complex of settler colonialism. And sometimes it's really hard to do that. And to illustrate, I'm going to tell a story about myself that's kind of funny and it's kind of embarrassing. And to me, once I understood what it meant, it really drove home just how insidious settler colonialism is. When I was doing my graduate research, I spent some time in Inuvik and I went out to a moose hide tanning camp. And that's where I first met the late Mary Barnaby and Judy Lafferty from Fort Good Hope. And they were teaching a bunch of us how to tan moose hides according to the Dene method for the first time. So I was there, and one of the first things you have to do with the moose hide is you take the hair off the hide, and then you flip it over and you take the meat off the other side. So I was sitting there in the grass at Lucy Adams' camp by the Mackenzie River, and we were taking the hair off the hide, and I noticed as I slid the knife underneath the hair, it revealed the moose's skin. And so we were sitting there doing this for probably about 10 minutes, me and this young Gwich'in guy, and I sat back and I looked at it and I went, hey, the moose's skin is brown underneath all this hair. And he looked at me and he goes, what? You thought that moose would be white just like you? And he started laughing and we both started laughing, and it was this, and I just kind of sat there stunned for a minute, and I hadn't even thought about it, but I had expected that the moose would have white skin just like me. And the thing is that it was so ingrained in me that I wasn't thinking that at the level of thought. It wasn't a conscious thought. And I think that's something that demonstrated to me that even at that point, when I had, sort of focused my life on looking at self-government and looking at this dysfunctional relationship between the state and Indigenous peoples, I myself was still not in a place of being able to get past my own settler colonial biases. I just want to end by saying the first agreements that the Dene ever signed were Treaties 8 and 11, and the Dene view these as agreements establishing peace and friendship with settlers and settler governments based on the concept of coexistence. And coexistence, what I understand from Dene people I've talked with, is coexistence is about reciprocal, respectful relations. And settler colonialism is not respectful. It is disrespectful, and it's unjust. So if we want to live coexistence, it's not about just living politely and peacefully side by side. It has to be about actively resisting settler colonialism, and we have to start with ourselves as settlers. We have to start with critically examining our unearned privileges and unjustifiable privileges as settlers. And I think once we start doing that, that will open up spaces for respectful dialogue, for just dialogue, and for an actual state of peaceful coexistence here in the Northwest Territories. Thank you very much.
Dr. Irlbacher Fox, Masi Cho, thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear your words again. I always find your passion so invigorating. You are a mind bomb. Masi Cho, thank you.